The most impressive thing about the experimental side of the Beatles is that even though they were mostly known for their psychedelic awakening, that is actually just the beginning. Among the songwriting force of the band, multiple other genres are being used: Indian classical music, baroque, metal, punk, and you get the point. But because that's the case, an interesting question arises: who was the most experimental member of the Beatles?
Paul, about a year and a half ago, there were quotes on the wire about your discussion of LSD and some other things, narcotics.
Yes, Larry.
It seemed to me from what I read that you had endorsed it and condemned it.
We were manufacturing it.
What's the story?
No, the business went bump.
This is a topic I've been wanting to talk about on the channel for quite some time, mainly because there's a lot of talk about Paul McCartney and John Lennon and how one was the experimental one and the other one was the melodic one, and George Harrison was like a blend of the two. But in reality, when you explore the discography of the Beatles, you sort of realize that the balance in terms of who made the most experimental pieces is quite disorganized. It kind of depends on the times and, the year and the era of the band. If you go to the psychedelic, you probably have one answer. If you go to the late stage of the band's career, you probably have a different answer. And if you go to the early years, based on melody and tempo, I think the answer may surprise you quite a bit. I'm pretty sure if you were to get like an overview of the band's catalog, the answer would be pretty clear. It's John Lennon with songs like Strawberry Fields Forever, Your Blues, A Day in the Life, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Tomorrow Never Knows. But I think that a lot of people who argue this tend to ignore the fact that the music was released in the 60s. Okay, so songs like Eleanor Rigby, for example, If I Needed Someone, Think for Yourself, I Need You, songs that sound like they could be on the radio nowadays, but that doesn't really mean that back in the 60s when they were released, they weren't innovative or unique. As a matter of fact, the reason why the Beatles are called the most influential band of all time is precisely because their practices and their songwriting formula is still being used today by a majority of the songwriters and the producers of the mainstream. So if you were to take all the context and every piece of media the band released, who really was the most experimental member of the Beatles? Well, to decide that, I'm going to go through each and every single songwriter of the band: George Harrison, John Lennon, and Paul McCartney. Not Ringo, because even though he was pretty unique in terms of, drumming, and he did create basically a style of drumming that became really popular in the 70s and the 90s, I personally believe that the uniqueness of the Beatles and their title as one of the most experimental bands of all time came from the songwriting front. So we're only going to focus on the three songwriters of the band. I think it's important to note that the way I'm going to rank them is going to be solely based on the influence and the uniqueness of the compositions, not really the quality. So even if I don't like certain songs, if they were unique, if they influenced a huge amount of people, that's what's going to, give them the point or not. So if you disagree with me, you can go ahead and leave a comment down below so I can give you my opinion on your opinion and we can have a conversation in the comment section. I don't really want to make this intro too long, so let's go with the first Beatle, George Harrison.
What do you and Ringo do while John and Paul write songs?
We play marbles or marples.
I already know that a vast majority of you is really annoyed at me right now for putting George Harrison so low, but allow me to explain myself. Even though I know that George Harrison not only introduced a new genre to the rock scene, he introduced a new genre to Western society by adopting the customs and the sound of Indian culture in his music, in songs like Love You Too, Within You Without You, Blue Jay Way, The Inner Light, and a bunch of other compositions, including a whole soundtrack album. I know the impact it had on the band's sound in songs like Norwegian Wood, for example, one of the most important songs ever released by the Beatles because of its storytelling, because of its weird performance style by John Lennon, but also because of the sitar that's used to adorn the instrumentation of the song. And that is really impressive. The fact that I'm putting George Harrison so low doesn't mean that I don't think he was a massive influence for the rock scene in the 60s and the 70s, and maybe even the 80s, but we're talking about John Lennon and Paul McCartney. When I explain to you some of the things they did and some of the things they influenced, I'm pretty sure you're going to agree with me that even though George Harrison was by far the most unique, because it is true that songs like It's All Too Much and The Inner Light once again, and that entire soundtrack, I can guarantee that you're not going to find anyone else in the 60s doing something remotely similar. But that's the thing. It was only for a couple of years. It was only from 1965 to 1968. After that, in 1969 and 1970, and actually through the entirety of his solo career, George Harrison's compositions were not really all that inventive or all that unique. You had songs songs like My Sweet Lord, If Not For You, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Something, Here Comes the Sun. Even though those compositions use synths and use instrumental practices that were not really known at the time or were not common at the time, they were only used to adorn the track. Instead, Paul McCartney and John Lennon at the time were using it to basically modify the way that pop music sounded. And that's exactly why, once again, even though George Harrison was probably the most unique and most unpredictable member of the band, you never really knew what you were going to get with George Harrison. You know, you can have a monumental masterpiece like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, but then a song like Piggies, which is a slightly political song, and then a song like Long, 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 which follows a pattern that no other song in 1968 followed. I personally believe that he put so much energy in this new sound that he kind of forgot about the fact that he had to adapt it to the sound of the Beatles, and that's something that didn't happen with John Lennon or Paul McCartney. That wasn't always the case, though, because when you go to the very beginning of his songwriting career in 1965, in 1966, in albums like Help, Rubber Soul Revolver, you have songs like If I Needed Someone, Think For Yourself, using the fuzz bass and shinier guitar patterns to adorn the track and to make it a little bit more psychedelic without going full psychedelia, which matches the sound of Rubber Soul perfectly. Then you go to Help, and you have songs like I Need You, which uses the volume pedal to add this layer of pop sensitivity to the song, creating this crossover between the sound of the Beatles and pop music. Then you go to Revolver, and you have the first political song the Beatles ever released in the song Taxman. You have the Indian classical trip, the dreamy and unique Love You Too, and then of course the melismatic vocals, the harmonious dissonance, and the chaotic piano playing in the song I Want to Tell You. There's a lot of experimentation blends in the songwriting flavor of George Harrison in those early years, but unfortunately he went full throttle in 1967 and 1968, creating a few years where his identity as a Beatle was very confusing and very inconsistent, which is basically why I'm putting him so low.
Why is it, Paul, that you're always described as the most intelligent one of the Beatles? Are you?
No, I'm not. No. Well, John's written a book, so he must be more intelligent than me. You've got to be intelligent to write books.
This was a very difficult decision because part of me wanted to put Paul McCartney as the most experimental member of the Beatles. I do believe he kind of deserves it because I think that without Paul McCartney's pop sensitivity, without his melodic nature, a lot of the most popular experimental John Lennon songs wouldn't really be that popular. I've explained in this channel multiple times why, in my opinion, Paul McCartney is the most important member of the Beatles. Not only because he pushed the band to make more albums after Brian Epstein died, not only because he basically became the leader when the band needed him the most, but also because his melodic sense, the fact that he was such a talented songwriter when it comes to melodies, was basically what made the band so popular. Of course, John Lennon is also one of the greatest songwriters of all time, maybe even more prolific than Paul McCartney himself, but he didn't really have that pop sensitivity that Paul McCartney dominated so fiercely. What I mean by this is really simple. When you go to songs like Twist and Shout, it's obviously that it would have been popular regardless of Paul McCartney being there or not. When you go to songs like All My Loving by Paul McCartney, it's clear that he didn't need John Lennon to make it a successful song. But when you go to 1964, 1965, when you go to the point where the band started to make compositions that were a little more dark and a little more mature, you do need some sort of melodic sense to make the song popular so it can be on the radio, so it can be on, so it can be a successful song, basically. So when you have songs like Norwegian Wood, Help, I'm a Loser, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, songs where John Lennon was starting to show the true nature of his songwriting, you have quite a lot of Paul McCartney input in every single one of those songs, even if John Lennon later denied it. And you don't even need to look that deep as to look at all the compositions that John Lennon was doing in 1967, many of them amazing, like I Am the Walrus, and Day in the Life, and Strawberry Fields Forever, and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, but you also must look at the other side of the coin, the terrible songs that John Lennon was making back in those days, like Good Morning, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. Maybe not terrible, but definitely bad compared to the ones I named just a second ago. What I'm trying to say here is that basically Paul McCartney had a huge influence and a huge role in the innovative vein of the Beatles. He was able to take the ideas of his bandmates and add a little more of a melodic sense of pop sensitivity, a friendlier tone to the audiences, and that, in my opinion, is what caused albums like Revolver, Rubber Soul, and Sgt. Pepper to succeed succeed even though they were so different from anything else at the time. With this, I don't really want to say that his own songwriting wasn't inventive, because the orchestra and his segment in A Day in the Life, She's Leaving Home, Eleanor Rigby, one of the most ridiculous sounding songs in Revolver. When you go to 1968 and 1969, the things he was doing with his vocals in songs like Back in the USSR, Obla-Di Obla-Da, Why Don't We Do It on the Road, Helter Skelter, known to be one of the first metal songs ever made, and then you go to Oh Darling. Paul McCartney is a man of ideas. Maybe he's singing the same melodies he's been singing for years, but he offered a new way to look at them, a different way of presenting the melodies, and that made the songwriting interesting. So even if, the overview is that Paul McCartney wasn't really the most experimental member of the band, and George Harrison, in terms of experimentation, should wipe the floor with Paul McCartney because of the Indian stuff and because of the acid trips his songs were known to be, when you look at the instrumentation, when you look at the backing vocals, when you look at every detail that supports those compositions and make them possible, Paul McCartney is constantly there. And that's only when you look at his work with the Beatles, because if you were to jump into his solo discography, you have McCartney 1, the first album to be produced, written, and performed by the same guy. You have Ram, which is the first indie pop album ever made, and McCartney 2, the first Beatle to embrace new wave in a way that's really, really compromising. He went full throttle with it too. So even though I can already hear all of you typing saying that Paul McCartney is overrated, that George Harrison was way more experimental and innovative and a better songwriter overall, I guarantee that if you explore the story of the band and you look at the context and his participation in a lot of the songs that he didn't even write himself, I believe you will agree with me when I say that he was the second most experimental member of the band.
John, why did you have to get married?
Because the same reason anybody gets married. Don't want to be slushy like, but you do, don't you? When you want to get married, when you got to go, you got to go. I always say.
Now it's time to talk about Johnny, and I'm really excited because if there's one thing I love talking about when it comes to this man, is his songwriting prowess and how innovative he was with it when he was with the Beatles. After he left the Beatles is a completely different story. Part of the reason why his discography is a little bit disappointing is mainly because there's not this innovative vein in it anymore, and that's kind of like what makes his solo discography so plain and so boring at times, in albums like Mind Games and Sometime in New York City and all these other records where he's basically just trying to relive or reignite his melodic talent he had with the Beatles. But when he was with the Beatles, the quality of his songwriting was constantly at an all-time high. In the early years, it was pretty normal, rock and roll tunes, a little bit more melodic, once again thanks to Paul McCartney in albums like With the Beatles, Please Please Me, and even Beatles for Sale. But in this album, Beatles for Sale, he showcased a different style of songwriting in the form of songs like No Reply and I'm a Loser. Very influenced by Bob Dylan and his work in albums like, The Freewheeling and The Times They Were Changing and Another Side of Bob Dylan, obviously. The melodies were pretty much the same, but the instrumentation was way more simple. The lyrics were getting way more detailed. The scenarios and the portraits they were painting were way more precise, and that made the music more exciting. And then when you go to Help, the 1965 soundtrack album, you have songs like the title track, songs like You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. The instrumentation was getting really interesting too, but the main focus when it comes to John Lennon was his lyrics. But it was in Rubber Soul that we saw a completely different version of John Lennon, my personal favorite. Songs like Norwegian Wood, the incredible storytelling showcased in that song. Then you have the urgency, the desire, the lust in the song Girl. The nostalgic and beautiful lyrics in the song In My Life, and the menacing, dangerous performance in the song Run for Your Life. I mean, he was completely dominated by his songwriting urge in this album, and I feel like that showcased an awakening for songwriters back in 1965, because music was a form of entertainment. I say this all the time in my channel. Before the Beatles, music was nothing but a form of entertainment. Of course, you already had pieces of music that were known to be some of the most respected and acclaimed in the industry at the moment. However, the Beatles made music something a lot more exciting and interesting, alongside Bob Dylan, alongside people like Jimi Hendrix, alongside The Who. They made a music revolution. And when I find moments and I try to pinpoint the part where it became the most obvious it was happening, I find John Lennon's compositions in Rubber Soul to be that. But that's the thing, even though it's really important and it's more than enough to make him one of the most legendary songwriters of all time, it was only the beginning. 1966 Revolver saw John Lennon go completely nuts in songs like And Your Bird Can't Sing, She Said, I'm Only Sleeping, using reversed tapes and loops and using the guitar backwards, like so many different unconventional practices that made the music sound like it was from 20 years in the future. And then of course you have the acid trip, the LSD masterpiece that is known as Tomorrow Never Knows, where you hear sounds of birds flying at 1,000 miles per hour. The automatic double track that is used in the song to make John Lennon's voice sound so powerful and omnipotent inside of the track. So many different elements that make the song feel like something that doesn't even belong to this world, But once again, that was only the beginning. Now we have Sgt. Pepper. The Sgt. Pepper sessions might just be the most fruitful ones in the entirety of John Lennon's recording history. Not because of the amount of songs he put out, because if we're talking about that, then the early years of the Beatles and maybe 1968 were the most fruitful ones when it comes to numbers, but when you look at the quality of the songs, Baby You're a Rich Man, All You Need Is Love, I Am the Walrus, Strawberry Fields Forever, A Day in the Life, two of the greatest songs of all time, by the way, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and yes, he had some pretty bad songs, once again, as I said in the beginning of the video, Good Morning, and Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, along with some others that were never really released, probably because of the poor quality of the songs. It doesn't really matter. The lineup I just made is more than enough to crown this man as one of the greatest of all time. But once again, this is only the beginning, because 1968 saw the most bizarre and daring version of John Lennon in the form of the Unfinished trilogy with Yoko, for example. All of his compositions in the White Album, like Your Blues, Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey, I'm So Tired, The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill, Sexy Sadie, compositions that if you were to hear them without looking at the dates, you would probably think that they were released years, maybe even a whole decade after the Sgt. Pepper songs. Basically, when talking about the most experimental member of the Beatles, you can only go for John Lennon. There's no other option because of the maturity of the lyrics, because of the unique and weird nature of the instrumentation, and of course, because of the honesty and rawness of his performance. This man was ahead of his time, and I cannot stress this enough. Even though George Harrison pretty much introduced a new genre to Western society, and Paul McCartney had an interesting way of blending the mainstream with the experimental, there's simply no one else that could take the title of the winner in this video than John Lennon. That is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.